Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Radlick. Thank you for joining me again for this particular podcast. Now, one of the things that has been a topic of great concern, certainly over the coronavirus pandemic and in other contexts, has been the growth in violent extremism. It's probably good at the outset to just say that there's various kinds of violent extremist ideologies, and that people need to be careful when they're dealing with the topic. What I want to do is talk to someone today who is actually a person who deals with the area of violent extremism and counterterrorism as a matter of profession, training and interviewing people and looking at the causes that and the way in which people can be is pulled out, disengaged from that kind of activity. Shane Healey is an expert in counter-terrorism. He does a fair bit of work in both training and investigating the area. And Shane will take us through some of the issues that you, as a person who might have people going down a rabbit hole, need to be aware of if someone you love or a friend of yours, somewhere along the line, is getting radicalised. Shane, thank you for joining me.
How you going, Tom? Thank you.
Absolute pleasure to have you on board for this one. Now, before we sort of dive into the subject matter, there'll be those who've never heard of you before. What would your career look like if you had to sketch it out or write it down on the back of an envelope for somebody?
I guess, in a nutshell, former military intelligence analyst that served pretty much 10 years straight in the Middle East, looking at the various terrorism organisations, and then working in a domestic capacity, seeing how that influenced Australia. And then when I left the military, I started working for government in the counter-violent extremism assessment intervention space.
And that's been a fairly extensive period of time, as far as I can tell from your bio. Now, what you've got in today's situation is there's a lot of focus and a lot of talk about violent extremism. How do you define that to someone that is only familiar with media coverage of the issues related to extremism? What's your baseline when you're talking to someone and introducing them to the topic?
So the first thing that I do is I explain the concept that society, or normal society, is like in a fence or a paddock, and you have your normal standards and customs, belief, traditions within that. And then on the fringes of that, on the fence, we'll call it, is where you start getting people with extreme views, ideas, beliefs. At this point, we're not talking violence. It could be vegans, for example, or could be, I used to joke about CrossFit, but people who have views that are a little bit outside of the mainstream, or what normal society, quote unquote, believes or enjoys, then people might label them as becoming radical. So, if you go to the 60s, the hippie movement, they were radicals, and then the more radical an individual or that belief structure becomes, it becomes to an extreme level where they actually might find themselves outside that fence or outside that paddock of what normal society believes is within their traditional values. And then once they're outside and that extreme belief becomes more, ideological and prevalent, then they're on that potentially pathway to accepting the use of violence in order to achieve their goals, which then becomes violent extremism.
Made the point in the introduction that people need to be careful when they're approaching the topic, because there's a lot of ideological flavors out there, if I can use that term. Is that something that concerns you about the general discourse at the moment that's taking place with the coronavirus and other things, where there's at times there appears to be a blending of things when in fact it can be far more complex?
Yeah, and I think we've always had those fringe elements of the mainstream, always. What even and a lot of them in the past, like the suffragette movement for women, have been more notable and successful. The problem with today's society and social media, clickbait, everything happens straight away. So those, especially in law enforcement, are always on the back foot, whereas previously it wasn't so fast and rapid and dynamic, and you were able to understand a fringe group or ideas or beliefs, and prior to them, becoming a problem and potentially becoming violent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, social media tends to accelerate many things.
It's like gasoline.
Yeah. One of the things we've noticed is the speed at which misinformation spreads. Yeah.
Well, and correct information that gets branded misinformation because it doesn't fit with someone else's narrative. That's a key issue at the moment too, especially with coronavirus.
Yeah. In this climate where things spread quickly, things can be branded differently.
Yep.
And people are confused.
Yeah.
If you're a parent, or let's take COVID-19 for a moment, and we can sort of traverse a couple of other things shortly. But what are the things that people need to look out for? The signs that somebody might be entering into a phase of, becoming radical.
Yeah. So I do a lot of work in this space. I spent 2 years working with youth justice in New South Wales, and I used to teach a radicalisation and awareness program, and we used to use 6 indicators, and conduct was one of the first. So has your child, started changing their pattern of behaviour? Are they online more? Are they wearing different clothes? And then statements. So are they changing their vernacular or being more almost argumentative in some ways, pushing back on certain ideas? Then their interests. Have their interests changed? So this could be finding religion. This could be finding a political party, or finding a new person or group to follow. Then their associates, their social network change. They start associating with completely different people. So outside of their school or outside of their sporting networks, they may stop playing sport and go to gatherings or online forums. Their appearance, they might shave their head, they might get a tattoo, they might grow their hair, get an earring. And usually with youth, they're very action orientated and less vocal. So they'll let you know via, the appearance and statements, rather than saying mum or dad. And then, youth are very susceptible to influence. So again, it's who are they listening to or watching the news? They might pay attention to certain topics on the news which they haven't before, and then they might have an opinion on that. So, if we use again the COVID-19 analogy, all of a sudden they're becoming very interested in some of the reporting at the 6 o'clock news. And then if you ask them about it, they get very defensive on their views. These are all key indicators of someone who has started down the path of radicalisation.
Now, that can stop at any given. They can stop at any given point. I mean, I think one of my sort of favourite go-to, I guess, thinking tools in the area of extremism and radicalisation is a twin pyramid that was that sort of focused on by Clark Macaulay and Sophia Moskalenko. They talk about radical opinion, radical action. In the work you've done, speaking generically, at what point do people go from, and it can be difficult to tell, I acknowledge, but what's the tipping point for somebody that sort of sits there and expresses opinions as opposed to goes out and starts either donates to a cause or attends a protest or goes around graffitiing at night, which is something that happens in some cohorts?
I teach and strongly believe in a 5-step process, 5-stage. And this first stage is the entry point. Something gets that individual interested in that new narrative or belief. And so that's the second stage, the narrative. What are they listening to? What are they reading? What are they starting to talk about, engage with? And then that can build it. And because it is a process, that can be, weeks to months, just building that their belief and their knowledge base of whatever it is that they're starting to engage with. That's then usually get a stage 3, a flashpoint. Something will happen that will solidify their new belief structure. So it could be the government are against us. That's why there's all these lockdowns or, whatever it is, all the way through to, some of your terrorist organizations' ideologies. Then you've got the stage 4, the real cementing of their new belief structure or ideology that this is correct and I'm all in, essentially all the chips are in the middle of the table. And then the last stage is the acceptance of violence, which is what turns that from radicalisation to violent extremism. Now, in especially disenfranchised youth, that acceptance of violence can actually happen a lot earlier than the belief and the flashpoint. And that's one of the things that in my line of work, we're really looking for in the with those indicators that I spoke to earlier, and early intervention.
One of the things I have noticed over the past 2 years is the influence of certain channels on certain messaging apps. 2, possibly 3 years ago, you wouldn't have seen people jumping on messaging apps and talking about, returning capital punishment, for example.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have seen people driving around what I would normally associate a prop for a Alice Cooper concert in the back of on a trailer, to emphasise some kind of political retribution or some kind of retribution against political leaders. How do we explain that to people who were confronted with a picture of a gallows on a news bulletin? Because there are those who'll be sitting at home, living their normal lives, complying with medical orders.
Yep.
And they see something happen at a protest. How the hell do you explain that to people?
So I think, and the journalists and the reporting organisations have a lot of responsibility in their narrative of how they're reporting it, because that's what those people that you have to explain it to, that's what they're going to hear, the why. And I think there's a lot of sensationalism and a lot of doomsday in the current news cycle.
Okay.
I've noticed recently, no matter how much the government want to move on from certain topics, the media keep those topics alive because that's where the clickbait comes from, and people are more likely to click onto divisive content rather than, quote unquote feel good stories. And there's a fair bit of data and research that's actually gone into that, because now, like news.com.au, they track each story, and the moment it gets below a certain amount of clicks, they put a new story in, and the more sensational the story, the more clicks it gets, which is how they get that advertising revenue.
Yeah, just on that, how in engaging with the people you engage with, across the spectrum, does the role of media ever come up in conversations with people?
Constantly, because as someone who does the assessment and intervention of people that are on this path, they get a lot of their information, which then fuels their motivations, from the media. It could be, and it's been like that for a while, going back to the foreign fighter problem when a lot of young Australians were leaving to go to the Middle East. They were watching atrocities on the news and going, I need to do, or I want to do something about that. So, and then the news narrative was what they were feeding off, whether it be counter or agreeing with it. And we're seeing the same with COVID. So the media have a massive role to play in this space.
You spoke about sensationalism earlier. How do you talk about these things differently?
So I actually ask a lot more than I talk when I'm doing this kind of work, like, talking to individuals, because I'm trying to understand their point of view. I'm trying to understand their narrative, and their journey, because the only way that I can quote unquote get them out of that is to understand what got them in there. So, for example, there was a young male that I did some work with who was a convicted terrorist, and I said to him, "What would you say if I've got no issue with you being an extremist or an extreme Muslim?" And he looked at me, and I said it again after a couple of minutes, and he goes, "You're setting me up." And I said, "Why is that?" And he goes, "No one's ever said that to me before." I said, "Yeah, but no one that you've ever spoken to has lived in the Middle East and understands the beauty of, that religion at its core. So I have no issue if you follow the 5 pillars of Islam and, you pray 5 times a day and you live your life as a good Muslim. That's not an issue. The issue is when you think you have to, or you're allowed to, use violence to those that don't believe like you believe." And it really touched him. And it was the first time that he'd been engaged with on that level. And then, through later in the conversation, I actually got to his motivation and what got him in that thought process. And we started to do some very good work. So that's how the assessment intervention process is, especially with youth. They want a voice. That's why they're sometimes acting out, and you've got to understand what it is they want. And so the only way you can do that is let them talk, not get in their way.
The current climate is fairly fluid when it comes to extremism. We see groups emerge in places like, I guess, messaging apps like Telegram.
Yep.
Most people know what Telegram is. There's other ways in which people communicate. How important a role is it for people generally to understand that those forums create a kind of an incubator for nurturing extremism. What are your thoughts on that?
So I definitely think that the general public needs to be educated that that's what's taking place. But I wouldn't get, and this is from personal experience, people then get interested and want to know themselves. So in some ways, you can actually be helping the recruiters by getting the curious. And I've seen that play out. Someone I did some work with actually in Melbourne, he was wanting to do some charity work and then heard about Telegram, and that next thing you know, he's on some extremist platforms. He goes, I just wanted to understand how I could do some charity work overseas and where some impoverished, Muslims were, and I hit this link, and next thing you know, I'm in these forums and chat groups. So I think education is definitely required, but we've got to be careful how we do it.
It's a difficult one, isn't it, ethically?
Yeah.
You need to expose a dark world so people understand it exists and its implications. But at the same time, even having the conversation.
Yeah,
and telling people that world exists may draw some to it.
Yeah, and I'll give you a really good example that I use a lot and lived it, to be honest. When Al Qaeda started producing their magazine, the Australian Signals Directorate actually blocked its the ability for it to be downloaded within Australia, as they should. However, journalists got hold of it, so they would still write articles about it. And the problem with that is they would sensationalise some parts of it, and its use in, say, like the Manchester bombings and other places. So people were still getting the information anyway, and those that weren't looking, it was front page of, say, the Australian newspaper. So then they go looking for it. And the more you tell someone who's disenfranchised not to do something, the more they want to do it. So you're exactly right that there is a real, and I've lived and breathed this problem set for probably the last 5 years. There is a real danger in how and what you expose people to.
We've spoken a bit about the jihadist thing, we've spoken a bit about COVID. We've also seen a lot of coverage of whether they be fully fledged or embryonic or whatever, extreme right groups. What and then in some ways that coverage is important, but what are some of the effects of that kind of coverage of those groups that you can generally point to?
So again, and we were talking about this before we started the podcast. There was some news stories at the end of last year that the intention was to scare people, but they actually made a lot of people feel sorry for those that were exposed, because the next 3 weeks, all you read about was how people were losing their jobs, having relationship issues, and other problems as a result of this media story. So something that probably 1 in 1,000 Australians were aware of, now 1 in 5 were aware of. And they had genuine remorse in that to the grievance. So you enhanced a problem set because of sensationalism, and that's the real problem, especially in the right space, when you're actually playing into their narrative.
A couple of the prominent figures in an American organisation, National Socialist Movement, and they're no longer there, but they were prominent. And one of the things they said to me in conversation and interviews was that one of the best ways to deal with this kind of activity is to acknowledge that an extremist group has been behind certain activities, but to not name a group or an individual involved. Is that something that you agree with?
Yeah, 100%. Yep. And because then those on the fringe or are looking for an avenue don't have one or don't know. Whereas, and I'll use this is a pretty an open example. How many people that, talk about or use a swastika or whatever, how many of them have read Mein Kampf or actually understand the history of the Nazi Party? Probably 1 in a million. But because it's so known and available, everyone just goes to it.
And that points to the importance of symbolism and some of the things that are being done at the moment by governments to minimise the visibility of that stuff in order to get society.
And I go back to that media report at the end of last year that, all that did was increase the following of that ideology 100-fold. Especially, like I said, in the weeks after, when they saw people, lose their jobs, be outed, one of the papers had all their faces on it and names. Wrecked lives. So people then sympathise with that and they're drawn to the cause.
One of the things Moskalenko and Macaulay talk about in a paper that was published last year was in terms of enforcement and policing is the difference between policing action and policing opinion. Their view is that if you start to go down the road of policing opinion, however that takes place, you actually run the risk of radicalising more, that process may result in more radicals, as opposed to focusing on where a genuine problem might exist. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, I do not believe that law enforcement has a role in the intervention of extremist organisations until they break a law, because that's what law enforcement focus on. And I've seen that in the local space really prevalently in the last 18 months, that they're more focused on an arrest than intervention. There's some cases, and I'm actually writing about it at the moment, where early intervention, which was actually done, could have turned around these individuals and got them back on the path as being very functioning members of society. But instead, they were essentially coerced to the point where they broke laws and then got arrested.
So there were swings and roundabouts in the process.
Yes.
Okay. You've been really, really generous with your time today, Shane. So
I think it's a really important subject that needs to be spoken about in the current context, because I think on a number of fronts, society's a bit of a powder keg at the moment.
I guess we could talk about this all day, but which we won't, obviously. But
happy to.
In the context of looking at where a parliamentary committee may go when the parliamentary committee releases its report, at whatever point it happens, is there anything you'd like to see come up from as a recommendation, something that might help minimise the number of people involved in violent extreme activity?
So education's the key, and there's some very good education tools. So, for example, the Living Safe website, Living Safe Together Australia, it's called. There's some excellent tools on there for families, parents to begin conversations with their kids, their friends, their relatives, to start identifying and understanding if someone is starting to have those thoughts or beliefs. It starts in the house, and that's where it quote unquote festers. Not because it's anyone within the house's fault if someone starts on that path, but you live every day with them and you can identify those indicators we spoke about earlier. But there's no education tools out there to help parents, friends, colleagues with that conversation, with what's next. All we see at the moment is to ring the National Terrorism Hotline. And I don't think as a society we want that to be our first point of call. You know, I think we've got to be able to educate and have a conversation. Because a lot of times that's all they're looking for. They want to be heard. They want to voice their opinion. They want to ask questions and they want some answers.
Okay. There's one thing before we finish. It's been fascinating talking to you. We know that there are different beliefs, there are different traditions around the world. You've come across them operationally in the work you've done over several decades. How important might it be for people to be taught about, say, comparative religion, comparative philosophy through their secondary education?
I think that's what high school should be for. History, geography, two subjects where this should be discussed. Just we're starting to talk about Australia Day's coming up, and is it Invasion Day, and why do people think that? When was Federation? I won't call it misinformation, but I'll call it uneducation of 80% of Australians that don't understand the difference in dates and the different roles that happened in our history. You know, if I asked 100 people, did they realise that New Zealand was in the original vote for Federation, 99 wouldn't know that. So I think history really, it starts in school, high school. They should know about Islam. They should know about Ramadan. They should know about Easter. They should know about all your religions. Then that's education. Education is the key.
But by the way, if we had New Zealand as part of Australia, we wouldn't be so stressed out about the All Blacks winning everything.
Correct. And we claim most of them anyway. But you're exactly. But people don't know that. Like, they said no. We're gonna go our own way in beach and rugby every year.
Shane, thank you so much for joining me. Can you just repeat the name of that website again that you mentioned earlier in terms of living together?
So it's Living Safe Together Australia.
Living Safe Together Australia.
.gov.au.
If you're listening to this and you've got anyone that's got a problem with respect to going into any ideology, it doesn't matter what it is, visit that website. That'll give you some ideas on how to handle it, who you can call and contact.
And a website that you can contact me on and other experts in this space is Phronesis Training and Consulting.
Okay. Shane, thank you so much for joining me. It's been great to have this discussion with you.
Anytime, Tom.